Hey guys, Saga here, and today I want to talk to you about something that's been on my mind for a while. Hearthstone and how to make it better. So Ungoro just came out, and if you haven't played Ungoro yet, I think it's probably the single best expansion to date. And this is from somebody who's been very skeptical of Hearthstone over the last, let's say, 2 or 3 expansions. And that's because with each expansion, the developers try with a light touch to slow down the game, to make it more control-oriented, to make good on that promise that I've heard, I believe I heard Ben Brode say it, that Hearthstone is a game about monsters fighting monsters. The problem is that people tend to find a way to make it a game about monsters fighting face. Aggro is a problem. It's a serious problem. And the first step to fixing any problem is to admit that there's a problem there that needs fixing. So this video is completely not from a player standpoint and completely from a game designer standpoint. So the challenge that I posed myself was, how do I change Hearthstone in a positive way without fundamentally changing the system? Now, what would I consider a fundamental system change? It would be something like allowing you to interact like with an instant on your opponent's turn. Like in Magic, if your opponent plays something, you can play something back even though it's their turn. Hearthstone purposefully avoided that, and for what it's worth, I think that was a good decision, because if you've played Magic the Gathering online, it doesn't translate nearly as well as it does in person to a digital format because of that, because of having to wait for your opponent to either play an instant or to not. And the way that Blizzard set up their game currently just works better digitally. And no matter what, we definitely owe Hearthstone that. Hearthstone paved the way for showing people how to make digital card games. Like Gwent, for example, would not be nearly as good if Hearthstone didn't exist. And Elder Scrolls Online, and Faeria, and Shadowverse, Epic. I mean, there's a ton of games that have been shown the way by Blizzard, pretty much. So I'm going to try to avoid sweeping changes like that, like big system changes, and still improve the game in some way. And this is sort of what I've been brainstorming for the last couple days, like how would I do that? Now this can be achieved in a couple ways. The first thing that comes to mind is just scaling down all 1, 2, and 3 drops. I think 4 drops are actually fine. I think by the time you get to 4 drops with coin and all that, you have access to enough of the tools that are going to be in any well-balanced deck that you don't really need to worry about it. But I do think 1, 2, and 3 drops need to be scaled down in stats, especially 1s followed by 2s and with the least priority on 3s. I mean like having any 1 drop not have more than 3 stats. So things like the new like 1/1 draw a card are fine. You could have a 2/1 or 1/2. Any more stats than that, unless it's like 0/4, is just not allowed. And I think that's because you don't want the game to be decided in the first couple turns. And the way the games have been going recently, it is not imbalanced in the way that a coin flip is not imbalanced, but it's not fun. It's not fun because Hearthstone is a strategy game, and strategy games have this implicit contract with the player that your wins and losses will be mostly decided based on strategy. A problem that leads to games being decided not on strategy, but rather on who draws what and who has what readily available in their hand during the turn that they need it. Slowing down the game in general would do a lot for that, and for what it's worth, it would still preserve regular archetypes, right? Like aggro decks would still be a thing. Turns 1, 2, and 3 would matter, but you wouldn't be able to just win the game off of getting a good 1, 2, and 3. Aggro decks in that world would expect to win a few turns later, something like maybe instead of turn 4, 5, and 6, maybe turn 6 or 7 or 8 even. And I think that's a good place. Like if you had mid-range win by about turn 10 or turn 9, somewhere in between there, and you had aggro win between turn like 7 and 8, like then the game would be adequately slow that the AoE that you put in, that everything else that leads up to that point in the game, that you get to see enough of your deck to play it. Now my second suggestion can be taken either as an and or as an or with my first suggestion. So my idea is, why don't we enable sideboarding? But not just sideboarding in tournaments or anything like that, but sideboarding as part of every single game. So like you start up a game and at the very opening screen you see your opponent's class, and then it lets you access your sideboard. So have sideboarding be just a part of deck making. You make a deck, and then you include 6 other cards that are not part of the main deck that you can then swap out. 6 cards I think is like a magic number for sideboarding. 6 is about 20% of your deck. It is 20% of your deck. And what that means is that you're unable to change the core of your deck, but you are able to change out enough cards to make big differences in certain matchups. So say Pirate Warrior is a problem again. Well, then you can tech against that. You can tech a lot of anti-aggro stuff. You could afford to tech 6 cards into it. And by teching those cards, and by leaving sideboarding an option, when something begins to get cancerous on the ladder, as long as counter cards exist, you can add those to your sideboard and not affect every other matchup. The problem is right now in Hearthstone, if you choose to tech against one thing, you are leaving yourself vulnerable to everything else. And you're cheapening your deck in other matchups, right? You don't want a Galaka Crawler in your hand versus a control matchup, right? It's just not going to give you the value you want. And you make your deck worse by playing that in order to tech against this one threat. Sideboarding would eliminate all of that, and I think it would help naturally deal away with aggro, right? Like as long as whatever the aggro thing isn't potent enough to just not care about any of your sideboards, you know what I mean? There should be enough specific tech available for you to sideboard to help you out with that. Now the one stipulation with sideboarding is I would remove, what is that card? I would remove Sacrificial Pack from the game. And the reason I would do that is because if there was ever a time where Control Warlock became a thing, you don't want Sacrificial Pack, which is like a nonsense card that no one ever plays, to then become a very potent sideboard option against Jiraxis, which is like a staple Warlock card. And to be fair, I think that this particular instance is the only instance that you could sideboard a direct counter to just like somebody's life, right? Like having an ooze, for example, doesn't mean that you've won the game. It means you got rid of a half-used weapon. But having Sack Pack against Jiraxis that you didn't put into your deck, that you didn't make sacrifices for, that just feels entirely broke to me, only because of how hard of a counter Sack Pack is to Jiraxis. Or you could just make heroes not affectable by Sack Pack, but you know what I'm saying. That's the only card I would get rid of for this format. So with Ungoro well underway, I'm kind of curious what you guys think. Do you think it's in a good place right now? I mean, I personally think the meta's decently healthy. What made me want to make this video is I was playing in this great healthy meta with all of these, awesome decks, and Pirate Warrior was still around. I feel like decks like Pirate Warrior that make literally the bare minimum of decisions, like, do I hit him in the face? Yes. Like, if there was a flowchart for Pirate Warrior, it would be like a fucking straight line. And the one thing that's always bothered me about decks like that is not that they exist or not that they're a thing. Like, honestly, there is a strategy to picking them, especially in a tournament setting, right? Like, if your opponent's going for something greedy, well, you can pick something super fast to punish that greed. But I don't feel like decks like that have any place in a strategy game because they don't really make decisions. And the decisions they do make are much smaller and less intricate and happen over fewer turns. And a lot of the wins that those decks receive is not because the other person didn't tech against it, but because they were unlucky enough to draw it, or because the card that they have is just unavailable to them. Like, it's in their deck, but they just can't get it. So, alright guys, I'm interested in knowing what you think. If you think Ungoro's in a good place, leave me a comment and tell me so. If you think the game would be better off slower, just for the initial 3 turns like I described, or if you really like the sideboarding idea, tell me about it. Or if you have a better suggestion, I'd be open to hear that too. Alright guys, I'll see you next time. My name's SixthSaga, and I make all kinds of shit. Here's a link to one of my movies, and a link to some of my other stuff. If you like my content, then subscribe. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go wash my hands, because self-promotion feels dirty.